Hi, and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, we're doing two Ray Harryhausen movies for Science Fiction Saturday. One from 1956, one from 1964. One in black and white, one in colour. So let's get started. I was looking for something to watch and something to do for this particular video when I found this in the archive. 20 Million Miles to Earth and First Men in the Moon. Ray Harryhausen double feature. Umbrella put this out a while back. They've still got copies of it. It's Region B, but it's going for about 20 bucks Australian on Blu-ray. So if you're interested, I'll post a link to that. Umbrella didn't pay for this. I paid for this one myself. But it's a nice little overview of a couple of Harryhausen's films, which bridge the gap between him doing black and white stuff in the 50s. 20 Million Miles to Earth was the last black and white movie that Ray Harryhausen did the special effects for. And the 1960s and the late 1950s as well, when he was moving over to colour. We'll start with 20 Million Miles to Earth because that's the first one of the two, and it's a lot of fun. Ray Harryhausen went back to Columbia Pictures after doing a couple of movies for another studio, and he and Charles Schneer, the producer, decided that they wanted to set one of the monster movies that they were doing in Rome. Mostly because Ray Harryhausen wanted to go on a holiday in Rome. So Schneer, Harryhausen, the star of the movie, William Hopper, and a small crew went to Rome and went to Italy, did a whole bunch of location shooting. There are a couple of the other characters who ostensibly appear in the scenes in Italy, but it's pretty obvious if you watch carefully that, say, the military guys are actually played by body doubles in the long shots. And then when they're in close-up, they're working against a rear projection screen, such as the magic of Hollywood. So the story's pretty simple. A spaceship returns from Venus. It had 17 crew on it, travelled all the way to Venus, came back again with samples and with a depleted crew because of a disease they caught there. And it was all done in secret. Nobody in the world knew about it except the American military because they could keep secrets like that. The spaceship prangs off the coast of Sicily and starts sinking. A group of fishermen rescued two of the survivors, one of whom has a fatal disease. And a little boy who is with them on the fishing boat finds a specimen capsule which has a gelatinous egg in it, which of course he goes and steals and then sells off to a zoologist he knows who's travelling through Sicily at the time. That does not go well. The egg hatches, sort of. It kind of disintegrates, and a small bipedal monster climbs out of it, which is known as the Ymir, because that was the original name that Ray Harryhausen gave the monster he was creating for another project. And it's kind of cute. It's about the size of, a chicken. The zoologist and his daughter, played by Joan Taylor, who ends up being the mandatory love interest, grab the thing, put it into a cage, and start travelling back to Rome in their truck, in their caravan, with the cage in tow. What they don't know is that this monster from Venus is growing at an exponential rate. It has a weird metabolism. It eats sulfur. It's very susceptible to electricity, and it breathes carbon dioxide. The Ymir gets taken to Rome and locked up in a special lab in a zoo in Rome, because that's the place I'd put a secret laboratory where you're testing and torturing a monster. Inevitably, there's a short circuit in the electrical current that's keeping it sedated. It breaks loose and starts wreaking havoc through Rome. It fights and kills an elephant, which it doesn't eat because it eats sulfur. It then gets chased up onto the top of the Colosseum, and a whole bunch of bazookas and anti-aircraft weapons take it down finally. The end. So that's the basic story, so we'll leave that part. Now, there's some interesting aspects to this one. For a start, William Hopper's an interesting guy. He was the son of Hedda Hopper, who was a gossip columnist, one of the two great gossip columnists in mid-century America, along with Louella Parsons. And he was always concerned with his acting roles. He was quite shy about being an actor, but he was encouraged because some people wanted to cater to his mum. He wasn't exactly a nepo baby because he was very, very adamant that he didn't want to get roles based on his relationship to his mother. And so he did a few films. He was kind of serviceable in them. He wasn't a great actor. He ended up playing Paul Drake, an attorney, in the long-running Perry Mason TV series with Raymond Burr. And, he made a living doing that, but not a great actor. There's a real antagonism between him and Joan Taylor's character, Marissa. She nurses him back to some kind of health after the spaceship crashes. The other guy who survived the crash dies of a really manky-looking Venusian disease. But the antagonism's really hard. He's a total arsehole to her, even though she's obviously tended to him and looked after his injuries.
I'm a doctor, or almost a doctor, and this man may be dying.
All right, almost a doctor.
Do you know what's wrong with him?
No, not exactly.
Well, I do. And I know it's fatal. 8 of my crew have already died from it. Now, if you must stay here, stand still and be quiet, please.
But he's a real asshole to her, but eventually they come around because you've got to have a mandatory love interest, otherwise people will think that your lead character's gay. Now, one of the best aspects of this movie, and it's nothing to do with the actors, is the Ymir. This is really good Harryhausen stop-motion special effects. The Ymir has personality. It reacts to things realistically, looks around it as much as possible like a genuine animal of some kind in a totally strange environment. It prowls around with its lashing tail. When it's unconscious, it breathes, and you see it breathing. I don't know whether they did it with a model in a bladder or whether they did it with the stop motion, but it works really effectively to sell the idea of this monster being a living being. And there are some really bravura moments in that. When the Ymir escapes from the zoo, the escape itself is done pretty well. Then when it encounters the elephant and it pushes the elephant falls over and crushes a couple of men. And then the elephant and the Ymir have a fight where you see the elephant's trunk wrapping around the limbs of the monster and trying to get a grip on it and trying to stop it from attacking the elephant. There's a lot of complexity to the movements of both creatures in those scenes. And there's a lot of painstaking work to do that, even though elephants would more likely try to headbutt or stomp on the monster rather than use their trunks. The trunks are quite sensitive instruments. It's a bit like using your fist in a fight when you can knee someone in the balls. You don't use a delicate, particular part of your body in a fight if you can possibly avoid it. But leaving that aside, it works well that the creature, which we see a fair bit of, there's a lot of stop motion in this one. It really is the best of 1950s Ray Harryhausen. There is a colorized version of this movie, and some of the stills I'll show in this video are from the colorized version. I don't think it was at all necessary to colorize it. It's not a movie or even a type of movie that particularly relied on color, but they did it because they were doing that kind of thing 20, 25 years ago. And they thought it was a cool thing to do, even though it never was. Now, the movie was directed by a guy called Nathan Jurett, who also directed First Men in the Moon. But he only directed the stuff that wasn't shot on location, the interiors, the rear projection stuff. He was a good action director, but he wasn't actually an actor's director in that sense. And the actors were left a little bit on their own devices because he never gave instructions to the actors about motivation or how he wanted them to play a particular scene. He was more interested in getting the job done, which to me is kind of abrogating part of your job. Part of your job is to manage the actors if you're making a movie with actors in it. But he didn't do that. And also in First Men in the Moon, the actors were really floundering at various times and were quite pissed off working with him. But he directed the studio scenes and the rear projection scenes. The bits where you actually see locations in Rome were directed by the producer Charles Schneer and by Ray Harryhausen himself, because Harryhausen wanted to frame the Ymir in the locations in a certain way, with some of the things in the foreground and some things in the background, and he would stop animate the monster in between them. He had a particular way of doing that, which gave a sense of realism. If you could see the monster with rubble in the foreground and the Roman Colosseum in the background, that sells the idea that the monster is actually in that landscape. And that's the sort of thing that Ray Harryhausen wanted to do to build the verisimilitude for his monsters. And the other interesting thing too is in some of those scenes in Rome and in southern Italy where they filmed the Sicilian scenes, there's almost a kind of Italian neo-realism look to some of the reaction shots from people. And I like that. It kind of plays a little bit like, oh, look, it's an outtake from a Roberto Rossellini movie, which I appreciated. That black and white cinematography in the bright Italian summer sunshine really worked. So I enjoyed this one more than I expected to. I'd seen it a few times, but I hadn't paid really close attention to 20 Million Miles to Earth. But it worked this time. It really lands it. The Roman locations make it different from a lot of other monster movies, which was set in, say, the Arizona desert or somewhere like that at the time. But this one, because of that differentiation, has extra interest. And of course, Ray Harryhausen doing the stop motion monster effects really works. Even scenes which weren't Harryhausen's, particularly like the sinking of the spaceship, They weren't perfect, they weren't anywhere near as good as you would have in a modern movie, but they really landed in their particular moments quite well for a 1950s B picture made by Columbia. The monster sells it, but the actors didn't. I didn't like the acting at all. I think it was second rate, but Columbia didn't really care about that sort of thing with their B pictures in the 1950s. Then we move on to 1964 and First Men in the Moon. First Men in the Moon is based on, of course, the H.G. Wells story. Originally, Harryhausen wanted to do a version of Food of the Gods, which, of course, Bert I. Gordon did a decade later. But he was convinced to do First Men in the Moon by Columbia Studios. And I think it was a good choice because Food of the Gods is not something you'd want Harryhausen to be a part of when you could actually do it by other means. I don't think it was necessary to have him there to make giant chooks and giant rats and things like that. I think it works better having him make aliens. In this case, a giant moon cow, which is kind of like a silkworm scaled up and given bug eyes, and the Selenites, which are insectile and look really good. Some of the Selenites, of course, were played by kids. This was filmed in England in Pinewood Studios. And sometimes when nuance was needed, Ray Harryhausen did it as a stop motion thing. The adaptation of H.G. Wells' original story was done by Nigel Neal, who we all know from Quatermass and from any number of other things as Stone Tape. It was his idea to put the frame story around this narrative of Victorian-era steampunk space travel. It's 1970 and a UN team goes to the moon and finds an English flag and a note saying that this moon is claimed for Queen Victoria, which was, they never got to tell her that, but inevitably that's the sort of thing a Victorian gentleman and his companions would do were they to land on the moon. So after finding this flag, UN officials go to the town of Dymchurch and try to find out who these people are, Kate Callender and Arnold Bedford. And they find that Bedford's still alive, living in a nursing home nearby. And they race to the nursing home. Nobody's told him that people have landed on the moon, because the nurses know that he was writing letters to NASA and to the Russian Space Agency telling them not to land on the moon because it's dangerous. And everybody thought he was a crackpot. Turns out he wasn't. He then, as a quite elderly man, and the old age makeup on Edward Judd is pretty good in this one. And they use things like fingerless gloves to hide the fact that his hands aren't all gnarled up. Tells them the story of how they went to the moon in 1899. It's a wonderful frame story. It's beautifully done. And then we go into the flashback. We get Edward Judd, fresh off being in The Day the Earth Caught Fire, playing Bedford, who's a little bit of a con artist. He's gone to a cottage called Cherry Cottage in the countryside to write a play because he's decided that that's a good way to make money, is to write a play. He has a beautiful girlfriend called Kate who is supporting him because she has a slightly rich family, and his neighbour is Cavor, played by the wonderful Lionel Jeffries, who's an inventor who's inventing an anti-gravity paste to paint on things so that they defy the force of gravity. Bedford and Kate meet Cavor, who's eccentric as hell. Lionel Jeffries was great at playing eccentrics. One of the best parts of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is Lionel Jeffries playing Grandpa and decides that he's going off on various campaigns by going into his little shed. Interesting thing here, Martha Hyer plays Kate. She was an American actress who was brought over to England to play the role. Martha Hyer was 2 years older than Lionel Jeffries when they made this movie, and in every year since then, of course. So she was 39, Lionel Jeffries was 37, and it looked like he was 55, because he had that kind of face. He went bald, his hair went grey, and he was good for playing old guys well before he was an old guy. 37 years old, and he looked like that. He was also older than Dick Van Dyke when he played his son in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, so there you go. But there's a nice little cameo in this. There's actually two nice little cameos. The first one is when the UN officials go to Dymchurch, and Miles Mallison is a local registrar. Miles Mallison had been doing character roles in movies way back in the 1930s, and he has a nice little bit playing the registrar. He had one of the worst toupees in movie history. I kind of appreciated his toupee this time around. There's a role of a bailiff's clerk who comes and tries to give a summons to Arnold Bedford, who was originally going to be played by Will Rushton, a kind of English comedy actor, but he got sick. There was a guy working on a movie called The Pumpkin Eater, a Harold Pinter adaptation, in one of the neighbouring sound stages, So they got him to do the role. It's uncredited. He comes in and does a nice little comedy bit playing the bailiff's clerk. It's actually Peter Finch. Years before Network, Peter Finch comes in and does this one-day role because they couldn't find anybody else to do it. And he went, yeah, I'll do it. While he's doing a Harold Pinter adaptation in the soundstage next door. And I love that. The production design in this one is fantastic too. The evocation of the equipment that Cavill uses to create the Cavilite and to paste it onto things is great. There's a steaming cauldron there. There's a kiln. There's a greenhouse where he's assembled the sphere he intends to travel to the moon in. And the sphere itself is really good. It's made out of cast iron beams and railway bumpers. It just looks right. It looks partly like a bathysphere, but also partly like a moving mechanical piece of Victorian era technology in the best possible way. And I was looking at the space scenes as well, the space scenes for not only the UN landing, but when Cavill's sphere goes to the moon and kind of crash lands on the moon. Those special effects are pretty good. There are a few matte lines, but there aren't as many as I expected them to be. And they're not really outstandingly bad. So I like the way they did the space stuff. This is 1964, 5 years before Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins went there. And it works well. Even though the moon doesn't look like the moon really does, it evokes it really nicely. And then Cavill and Bedford find the glass geodesic pit where the Selenites get their sunlight and their energy from. And all of that's done really well. The set designs on this are fantastic. There's an antagonism between Bedford's slightly criminal pragmatism and the idealism of Cavill as well. Cavill thinks that he can communicate with the Selenites and that things are going to be peaceful and they're going to communicate and there's going to be a millennium for the world and for the moon if they can make peaceful communication with this alien species. Whereas Bedford's a little more cynical about it because he knows that these guys are up to no good and he has an almost protective attitude toward Cavill because Cavill is a bit clueless. Edward Judd does a really nice job of portraying this character. He was a kind of actor who was almost made to play Victorian-era characters in some ways, even though, of course, he played modern characters quite well as well. But I like that. It's not an antagonism between them, but it's a disagreement between gentlemen in that sense. Character of Kate, even though she is a bit forthright when she's on Earth, she's more a damsel in distress kind of character when they travel to the moon, and that's a bit problematic. The other aspect I like is Nigel Neal pinched a conceit from War of the Worlds and had Cavill give all of the Selenites on the moon a cold, so that unfortunately they died out, and that leaves us with a dark possibility for this movie. Cavill goes to the moon, gives all the Selenites a cold. Meanwhile, Bedford and Kate have gone back to Earth. He's there by himself in the middle of an alien species that is dying out because of him. What were his last days and hours like? It's a dark thing to contemplate. And it really is the only dark side to this because it's made as an entertainment. It's made as a slightly kid-friendly movie, even though it doesn't cater to kids. I remember seeing this when I was a kid and being delighted by it. But I didn't think it through as far as Cavill's last days were concerned. But it's got that wonderful steampunk feel about it. Ray Harryhausen's monsters are very much a minor part of it. They're not central to the narrative in the way that the Ymir is in 20 Million Miles to Earth. But they're good at creating the world. And his moon cow is really interesting. It moves quite well. And when you see his versions of the Selenites moving, they're not in conflict with the kids in costume that you've got playing the Selenites in the crowd scenes. They very much fit conveniently and nicely into that. And I appreciated that. Of the two movies, I really like First Men in the Moon. For the reason I don't like 20 Million Miles to Earth, the characters are stronger, the characters are interesting, the characters are people with whom we can empathise, particularly Cavill and his mad idealism, and Bedford being a little bit of a rogue, and Kate being beautiful, I suppose. But those characters really land the movie in a way that 20 Million Miles to Earth doesn't need and definitely doesn't get. But revisiting these films was great. I enjoyed what they did. I enjoyed how they did it. And it's good to dip into the uncomplicated science fiction worlds of the 1950s and 1960s, and to analyse them from a modern lens as well, just to see the bits that work, see the bits that didn't work, and as a little bit of a mind experiment, just seeing how you would have changed it were you in charge of making these movies in a modern era. It's a nice little intellectual exercise if you're that way inclined to just see how you do it differently. I think Nigel Neal's script definitely lifts First Men in the Moon way above 20 million miles to Earth. At some stage in the future, I might do some of the fantasy films that Ray Harryhausen did between these two movies, because things like The Three Worlds of Gulliver and a couple of other films are quite interesting as well. So thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit the notification bell. You can also support the channel by donating at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. I'm doing the letters G and H in my A to Z of hidden gem movies in my next video at the end of the weekend. Looking forward to that a lot. In fact, I'm going to pick out the movies over there after I finish recording this one. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And then, of course, we've got random Wednesdays when I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I'll find something. So until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch a little bit of stop motion for the fun of it, and I'll catch you next time.